Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson Chapter 9, People of Middle East and Arab Descent. First let's just talk about dominant Arab discourse, which is basically things that people associate when we talk about Arab people. Um, People assume that they're Muslim, they have a lot of money, they're also terrorists, conservative, suspicious, and sneaky, closed off from non-Arabs, intelligent, Muslim extremists, terror suspects, foreign-born, their women are subordinate, and then the men are sexist. So one of the first things I want to introduce or talk to you is about this thing called the Arab Spring, which you might have heard of, but you might not know much about. So actually, I hyperlink right here a really quick video that explains the Arab Spring, which is basically a series of uprisings, demonstrations, gatherings, and revolutions that happened recently. And part of it is about social media, the fact that people can organize together very easily, right? Because of social media, how it became very effective. You have to think about prior to the internet, which is, maybe right around the time that you guys were born or whatever. Before that, if you wanted to get together, you guys would have to actually write letters and email and mail them in the post office mail to each other or call each other. Okay, there was no texting back then either, so this is definitely something that technology has revolutionized the way that people get together. It began in Tunisia, and then in Egypt, then Yemen, then Bahrain, Syria, Jordan, and Libya. By word of mouth, the airways, the internet, poetry, and rap. So you can see that people are using art to also explore and express themselves about basically feelings of injustice and stuff like that. What the purpose of the Arab Spring was because they want democracy. Okay, the concerns were that food inflation was going on, low wages, so people were not paid very much, high levels of unemployment, corruption, police brutality, and censorship. So you can sort of see how these are kind of universal concerns, right? And so this was happening in the Middle East. Most protests were peaceful and transformative, but some violence did occur. Recent Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi was killed by the rebels, and in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak was ousted because of this. Now let's talk a little bit about the actual location where people who are Arab or Middle Eastern descent are located. It's going to be located basically at this point where there's African, Asian, and European and Arab groupings, countries, basically all are placed next to each other. So there's Southwestern Asia and Northern Africa, spans from Morocco to Pakistan, so we're talking about Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Cyprus, Georgia, Iraq, and Israel. Okay, there's also Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. This is the home of the beginning of civilization. This is what they're talking about. Home of all three monotheistic religions. So basically that means kind of like a one type of God religion. And we'll talk about those religions in a little bit. So this area is known, some of it is really, really wealthy, and that's because of the discovery of oil. The creation of the State of Israel also, the revival of Islam, Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Persian Gulf War, America's war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course ISIS, which I'm sure you've heard of, right? If you don't know a lot about ISIS, this is like a quick BuzzFeed video that I linked to that kind of asks basic questions just to Americans to see if they know what ISIS is about, but they also provide the answers too. And I want you guys to know at least a little bit about what ISIS is about, so please watch that fun little video. It also talks about struggles to balance religion, development, and stability in an ever-democratizing global world. So what that is saying is, before, when countries are all separate, in people did not really do as much business. People could run their own countries the way that they wanted to. But now the fact that every country is kind of dependent on other countries or multiple countries, that means that the way that they behave and interact is going to be looked at or examined or put into the spotlight. Arabs originally applied to Semitic people of the Arabian Peninsula. So basically, people who are of Jewish descent, let's say, okay? Now describes people whose primary language is Arabic, which is actually very difficult to learn. So if you do speak Arabic and you use that as your bilingual part in your resume, you're actually going to potentially make a lot more money. Fourth most widely spoken language in the world. The Arab League of Nations, there's 21 countries that was developed on March 22nd, 1945, is Algeria, Bahrain, Comoros, Djibouti, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Oman, Palestine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Tunisia, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Syria was suspended because of inhumane methods of dealing with political opposition. So there was a lot of violence, and so they were basically suspended. There were acts of aggression on any member state as an act against all. So that's what people were saying is like, if you are violent to your own people, that means that you're violent to everyone. And that's not something that they approved of when we're talking about the Arab League of Nations. The purpose was to basically have close collaboration on economics, communication, culture, nationality, social welfare, and health. So basically getting together and trying to focus on these things that affect all the different countries. Encourage and promote their young talents, support women in their struggle for equality, improving child welfare, and seeking to solve decade-old problems such as the Israel versus Palestine, because of the territories and stuff like that. Iran is not in the Arab League, and their official language is Farsi or Persian. The U.S. Census defined Arabs as people who are Algerian, Bahrainian, Egyptian, Emirati, Iraqi, Jordanian, Kuwaiti, Lebanese, Libyan, Moroccan, Omani, Palestinian, Qatari, Saudi Arabian, Syrian, Tunisian, and Yemeni. Identifies themselves as white are people who are Egyptian, Lebanese, and Syrians. Palestinians whose ancestors originate in Palestine prior to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And if you're interested to learn more about Palestine versus Israel, I think that you guys should definitely do some more research because it's a long war and America is sort of involved in it, and it's very controversial, and it's been going on for a very, very long time. All right, now let's talk a little bit about Muslims and Arabs, the differences and the similarities. So Islam is younger than Christianity, and right there I put a link to explain a little bit more about Islam. It's the second largest to Christianity with 1 billion followers. Started in 7th century, about 610 AD in Mecca, city of in the Arabian Peninsula. Allah, or God, is conveyed by Muhammad, who was a tradesman, a series of revelations that form the basis of Islam. So basically, Allah told word for word to Muhammad, what this is all about. So Islam means peace and submission, submit to Allah, and recognizes that Muhammad is their prophet. When you see something beautiful, you should say, Masha Allah, which basically means this is God's will. You've also see it as mashallah instead of, as one word as opposed to 3 words, or 2 words instead of 3 words. The Quran, which is basically the book that is a direct instruction from Allah or God. Family members are expected to fulfill rules of behavior and family roles, such as how to be a husband, how to be a wife, or how to be a child. You might have heard of this phrase called Sharia law, or it's basically Islamic law or a path that guides all aspects of Muslim life. derived from the Quran, and the Sunnah, which is teachings from the Prophet Muhammad. Its an interpretation is controversial. Depending on how you read it and explain it, it's just like other books. I'm sure you've heard how people have used the Bible and explained it in different ways, right? So it could be very controversial. Islamic sects, there are the Sunni, which are 85% Orthodox Islam. There's also the Shia or Shiites, which is about 15%, and then there's the Sufis. So those are the different sects of Islam, Islamic sects. Sunni and Shia differ on the leadership after the death of Muhammad. The Shia of Ali basically believe that Muhammad's son-in-law Ali takes over, so it's more conservative. They believe more like their family, like the prophets are all from the same family line. The Sunnis, the caliph or the imam should be elected and does not have to be related to Muhammad. An imam basically is like the religious leader, so they could be the one who takes over as opposed to someone who's part of the family of Muhammad. So now let's talk about the 5 basic obligations of Muslims, which are also known as the pillars of Islam. The first one is oral testimony that there is only one God and that Muhammad is his prophet. 2. Ritual prayer must be practiced 5 times a day with certain words and certain postures of the body. So if you are someone who's become, let's say, an employment specialist or something like that, you will potentially hear of someone saying that they need to go pray at a certain time, and please let them do that, right? And they usually do it in private, and they'll do it very respectfully. So just to let you know, if you ever see someone praying at a workplace or at the airport, I see that because there's actually a room, because you're supposed to pray in a specific direction and everything like that. Very interesting. 3, the giving of alms, which is basically money or food given to the poor. 4 is keeping a strict fasting, including no liquid or food from sunrise to sundown during Ramadan. And I've hyperlinked you to a bunch of Muslim millennials and how they kind of see celebrating Ramadan in America with their, let's say, non-Muslim friends. And 5 is a holy pilgrimage to Mecca once in a lifetime at a specific time of the year. And you'll hear about that. And it's actually really controversial because of COVID, of coronavirus, where a lot of people were not able to do it this year because of that. The largest population of Muslims are actually not even in that area. It's in Indonesia. They do not speak Arabic and is not part of the Middle East. So that's really interesting, right? You always assume Muslims are people from, let's say, North Africa, Middle East, but the largest population of Muslims are actually in an Asian country in Indonesia. So I think that sounds really interesting. Arab means language and culture. Most Arab Americans are actually Christians. They're not even Muslim. So that's something that I think we mistake because of how we were told about people who are Arabic, right? That they're Muslim. Actually, most of them are Christian. 40% are Catholic, 23% are Orthodox, 23% are Muslim, and 12% are Protestant. Interesting, no? Lebanon has the highest populations of Christian. 15% of 1 billion plus Muslims are Arab. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the migratory patterns from the Middle East. So in 1890 to 1940, merchants and farmers immigrated for economic reasons from regions that were part of the Ottoman Empire. 90% were Christians from Syria and Lebanon. Then after World War II, following the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, Palestinians saw it as a loss of their homeland and pushed factor to migration. Educated and politically active are the ones who left. And then in 1967, there was an Arab-Israeli war, and people were escaping political unrest in their home countries. And of course, the Gulf War, which maybe your parents might know more about, was when the Lebanese and Iraqis came to America. So those are the 3 major migratory patterns from the Middle East to America. Let's talk a little bit about the demographics of people who are Middle Eastern and of Arab descent. 2006 to 2010, it was recorded 1.52 million reported Arabs. The largest Arab ancestry groups in the United States are Lebanese, then Egyptians, Syrian, Palestinians, Moroccans, Iraqi, Jordanians, and Yemeni. And they're pretty equally divided all over the country. So it's 25% in the Northeast, 27% in the Midwest, 24% in the South, and the West is 23%. Most amount of Arabs are in New York, then Los Angeles, Dearborn, which is in Michigan, Chicago, and then Houston. The languages that are spoken are Arabic, Farsi, Persian, Urdu, French, and Kurdish. Interesting, huh? Now let's talk about the U.S. Census Bureau classification as white. As we've talked about before with the Latinx population, for a while, people who are Mexican were considered white and then they weren't. So we're going to talk about something maybe a little bit similar to that when it comes to this population. The 2020 census, the plan was to include a classification called Middle East North African, or MENA for short. And I've hyperlinked that so that you can see a little explanation on what that really means by a person from there. Currently, the default is white. And guess what, you guys? This book was written before our current president, President Trump, was president. So the current 2020 census that just happened actually did not include MENA. So, and it's controversial, right? And so I actually hyperlinked an article for you guys to read that talks about maybe the reason why. And part of that is if we include Middle Eastern North Africa as white, the white people are considered the majority. If we now take apart a whole group of people and they can actually classify themselves as MENA, then white people actually can become to be seen as a minority. And as we know, with our current president, that's not something that he would want to do. So that's one reason why I encourage you to read the article, because it's really interesting to talk about, the possibilities of why, even though the previous president, which is President Obama, had proposed to put into the 2020 census MENA, we are no longer doing it, or we didn't do it in 2020. It denies Arab identities, increases in, visibility, and also influences among policymakers. And that's what we're talking when we say, the presidency, those are policymaker type people, right? And also, like we talked about with other countries like Asian people, when you group all Asian people together, you think automatically that they're all smart, successful ethnicities or Asians, right? But when we looked at the chapter, we realized that, let's say Vietnamese people, Hmong people are actually living in poverty. So the same thing is here is if you classify people of the Middle East and North Africa as being white, they're not going to have as many problems or seen as having many problems, right? So for those countries that do experience poverty and war and all that stuff, they might not get governmental assistance because they're labeled as white people, okay? Samir Khalef, president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, says also, if we do, let's say, separate it, then we might now really see those no-fly lists, right? Heightened security wherever we go, and considered white without white privilege, which is what we were talking about before. Like you're seen as successful and all that stuff, but then you don't get the help when you really need it. If not viewed as a minority, can lead to a dismissal of their issues with discrimination and stigmatization. Others argue that being included in white makes them feel more American. So you'll see a group of MENAs who will say, you know what, I actually want to be identified as white because that makes me feel much more like I'm part of America or the United States. So again, those people are have a right to say that, and then the other people who disagree with also is equally as right as well, right? So you're going to see, depending on the group or the community, they might see themselves very differently. Just like Latinx population, some identify as white and some do not, right? And sometimes because we live in Los Angeles, we're like, what? I don't get this. Why? But your last name is like, Spanish. So how can you identify as white? But the thing is, again, we all have different communities that we live in and we see the world very differently, even if we're all Americans. Now let's talk about social, psychological, and physical health issues. Life expectancy varies with economic status. So people who are of poverty. So if you're Arab and you're from Somalia or Muslim from Afghanistan, the wealth comes from the Arabs who are Kuwait, and of the United Arab Emirates and the Muslims of Malaysia. And the reason why those, the Kuwait and United Arab Emirates is because of that oil that we were talking about. The discovery of oil during that time period is when people really experience a lot of money because we all depend on oil, right? And this is why politics plays a big role when we say we want to, let's say, get rid of using oil in cars and use energy like renewable energy, such as solar power or whatever, or electricity. Then people feel like threatened that they're going to lose money, which is why you'll see people try to, let's say, influence policymakers to keep oil in use. Okay, 2/3 of women in Arab, 2/3 of Arab women are illiterate. So that shows you the divide between men and women and their educational values and their beliefs on, who is it that should be educated and who should not. But those things are changing as, again, we become more global, right? 85% of Arab Americans have high school diplomas. 4 out of 10 have a bachelor's degree or higher, and 64% are in the labor force. And when they work in America, they are management and professional positions, which basically means career-oriented, sales, office, and administrative support, service industries, production, transportation, and material moving, and construction, extraction, and maintenance. Muslims in the United States reject extremism by much larger margins than Muslims in other nations. So, and I think that's partly because America sees a lot of the time people who are Muslim or Arabic as being terrorists, right? So they really object to it, which is fantastic, which is good, because not all Muslims or people of Arabic or Middle Eastern descent are terrorists at all. Most of them are not. They're good, kind people too, right? But when we see movies, and usually the movie that's a terrorist is usually someone with an Arabic accent or someone of the Middle Eastern descent, we start to think, oh my goodness, everyone over there is evil or trying to kill America, when that is actually not really true. And here's a link for another explanation of Muslims in the United States. Emotional distress is displayed in terms of physical complaints such as somatization, which we've seen in other cultures as well. Instead of when we have experienced psychological stress, instead of saying that we have psychological stress, we're going to say, oh, my stomach hurts, or I have a really bad headache. Those are basically somatized from basic mental health. High tobacco use with this population as well. 45% of men and 5% of women smoke cigarettes, although it is increasing for women. We're talking about it being very popular in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Tunisia. Here's some other issues that go on in this culture as well, which is physical abuse, identity confusion, loss of extended family support systems because of the migration, adjust to a lower social and economic status, intergenerational value conflicts, which is basically like many other people of color or minorities, where the grandparents might have certain values, but the grandchildren might have different ones. Changes in the role of family members and parenting problems. Again, once people come to a different country with a total different set of values, there's going to be some problems that emerge, right? One area that I want to point out is that sexuality is a taboo subject. And when I say that, I mean it's seriously, you don't talk about them, right? But again, this is a generalization as of now. When you have a client that might be from this population, they might be very open to talk about their sexuality. But I want you to be aware that in general, sexuality is a taboo subject. But it's also a taboo subject in many different cultures as well, right? So when it comes to sexuality, we have to also talk about HIV. They have the lowest HIV prevalence rates worldwide at 0.1%. I've hyperlinked RAMA, which stands for Reaching All HIV Positive Muslims in America, just in case if you do have someone who is Muslim and HIV positive, that there's a resource for you and for your client. HIV is seen as a punishment for deviance, which basically means that this culture probably doesn't really see or accept or welcome people who are LGBTQIA, unfortunately. Religion is regarded as protection, so it's like basically saying God will protect me from, the bad stuff because I'm a good person, right? This population also has low alcohol intake. Another area that is very focused upon is virginity is a value in marriage. And that also goes along with many other cultures as well, right? Women are pressured to have children as soon as they marry. Tunisia is the only Middle Eastern country that has legalized abortion. Other countries have abortions but are likely to be unsafe and induced or unsafely induced abortions, which basically means it's kind of like secret. People are doing it, on the low down, and it's not necessarily clean or safe for this person, and they actually could die as well. So again, this is why we need to make sure that people have proper sexual health care, because it could also mean life or death for that person or that woman. After 9/11, many Arabs were subjected to discrimination. Direct link between discrimination and psychological distress. So because people of Arab descent were seen as terrorists all the time, they got really stressed out, which makes sense, right? People were discriminating because they're afraid. Are you a terrorist because of the way you look or where you are from? Lower sense of control and lower self-esteem. Islamophobia is basically prejudice against, hatred, or irrational fear of Islam and Muslims. So seen as a potential Muslim extremist because you meet someone, you're like, oh, that person looks like they're Muslim or, Arabic. So they probably are, have different un-American values that are awful, right? And that's not true. People see them as terror suspects, foreign-born and foreign-looking, oppressive towards women due to patriarchy and sexism, and seen as non-Christian. But again, remember, there's a lot more Christians than people think who are of Arabic or Middle Eastern descent. And they are also an understudied group. Part of that is because how private they are, they might not want to answer specific types of questions. So if you are able to work in this area in research, you will be contributing a great amount of info to society, which is great. Now let's talk about cultural orientation and values. It's very patriarchal, which, like we said in other countries, means that the man or the father in the family is the main decision maker. Hierarchical with regards to age and sex, so the older you are, the more respect you deserve. The children are basically least important. Communication styles are restrained and formal. So that means that people are not like hugging and playful and all that stuff. It's much more structured and proper. Everyone is supposed to behave a specific way. And this sometimes is seen in public. When you're at home by yourselves, your families might be very different, right? But there's an expectation of proper behavior and stuff like that. Difficult for Arab clients to disclose personal feelings and problems to someone outside of the family. The motto is to satisfy God is to satisfy parents. So you can sort of see right there, if you're raised that way, then you're going to be really obedient, right? And follow whatever your parents tell you to do. Family is a primary means of support, so you can see the collectivist attitude of this culture. Ummah, or nation, is solidarity based on common language, territory, economic interests, culture, history, and destiny. Muslim laws allow a woman to be contracted for marriage by her guardian or her father. Basically, your parents can marry you off, right? The more educated a woman, the older she is likely to be when she marries, which is not something that, if you want to have children immediately or your parents want you to have children immediately when you get married, it's not necessarily the best thing, right? But again, it's very different with each family. But if you are educated, it's more likely that you will marry later than you are when you're younger. Talking negatively about the family is considered unacceptable and embarrassing, and stuff like that, which is very common with other cultures as well. The value system there is hospitality and generosity in giving and spending, respect for elders and parents, wealth and preeminence of male children, so boys are valued more than girls, unfortunately, subordination of women to men, modesty, intensive religiosity, equality in all human beings, health and strength, final authority rests with the father, mention, which is considered or translated as crazy, when someone seeks help through counseling. So you can see how interesting their value system is, even though there is a set, right? There's still a hierarchy of who is more important than others, but to treat all human beings as human beings as well. So it seems like it might be very different, but it makes sense within the culture, right? Now let's talk about Muslim women. Women's treatment is inferior in the Arabic world. They're limited in their sense of freedom, mobility, social behavior, and decision making. Muslim women generally cover up their heads or hair with a hijab. Girls are raised to be private and modest with interactions with others and through dress. So you'll see often they're not really showing a lot of skin. Okay. Boys are raised to be leaders and show strength. Women are not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. And domestic violence does occur from brothers, husbands, and fathers. Okay. So just to show you that this is what's happening now, but imagine if you're a Muslim woman growing up in America. So you're going to be very pulled between two very, very different cultures, right? We're talking about people in America who are like, very sexy and explicit. When you twerk, that's very sexual, right? And then suddenly you also see the people who are wearing, basically a lot of clothing that hides their skin. So the cultures are very different. And again, we're not saying that being modest is a bad thing, okay? People are happy and stuff like that, then that's great, We're just saying the fact that there's a huge difference between the two. However, a person who is from this culture lives, that's how we respect them, right? Because this is their cultural value system, and that's great. It's only when they come to us as counselors with problems that are making them unhappy, we need to figure out why, right? And acculturation might be one of those major reasons why they come to seek help. Traditional Islamic laws allow men 4 wives. Polygamy is rare in modern Arab society, so it's not as common as it was back then. The Quran says not to marry more than one if he is not able to treat all wives equally. So basically, don't be greedy, right? Tunisia, it says they said that it's illegal for polygamy. Iraq seeks a court's approval, and Lebanon and Morocco says that a woman can request a premarital contract for divorce if husband decides to take a second wife. So that's really interesting to see how they see polygamy, and they also see wives and women. Now let's talk about the implications for mental health professionals, which is basically if you were working with someone of this population. Interventions with Arab clients need to be considered within the context of the family, the extended family, community, and even tribal backgrounds. Clinicians need to view Arab Americans as individuals rather than a group. So when a client comes in, you still see them as a person, but you need to also see how their living system, what is involved with that living system that they have. The parents, how close are they, and the community, how acculturated are they, and all that stuff. Many see therapy as negative and may mistrust it. Clients may expect the therapist to provide them with solutions to their problems, which is something a lot of people think, right? You go to a therapist and they're supposed to just tell you how to solve your problem. But really, that's not what it is. It's about the therapist going on a journey with this client to see how you can guide them, right? But it's up to them to decide how they want to change and what makes them happy. See counselors as authority figures, and that is true. We always see therapists as a person of power, right? Depending on exactly the situation as well. If it's a mandated issue, then there is power, because if you don't choose to, let's say, seek counseling, if it's mandated, you can either go to jail, you can get kicked out of school, whatever the probation or the rules are, circumstances are for that person. So there is some power, so we need to acknowledge that, but we also need to talk to them and let them know that's not all it is though, right? That we're actually here to work together. Structured therapies may be effective. So that means if there is structure, they might feel much more comfortable, right? Like other cultures as well. They're like, let's do some homework. Let's think about the homework assignment and examine how this has affected your way of thinking, okay? Maybe invited to the client's home, maybe even given gifts. So refusal actually may be seen as rude, and that actually is also in other cultures as well. So depending on how or what the gift is, we can also explore and talk a little bit about that as well. Or you can also set boundaries at the beginning and say that, personal gifts is not allowed or whatever it is, but let's talk about a different thing that you can do, like write me a card or something like that instead. Illness is an external locus of control. So what that means is, let's break it down. External locus of control. That basically means that when there is a problem, it's not that person's problem that caused it. It's some outside force causing that problem. So when someone's ill, that means someone has put some illness onto that person. Like it could be a curse, or it could be bad luck, or it could be destiny, but the person themselves do not own up to the responsibility of that, right? So illness is seen as an external locus of control. Fate. See fortune tellers, priests, imams, which are again worship leaders, physicians or healers to help them with the problems. It's not coming from within, it's actually because something else has put it on to them. And acculturation may be more stressful than typical, as we have seen in other cultures as well. The levels, right? And we want to be able to talk about that openly.